on Her Majesty's service. You are required to report where to go, when to arrive. No more. No words wasted. But there was one charming little addition, a postal order, like a cheque for those who didn't have a bank balance. What was it? It was your first day's pay in advance. How considerate of them. 4 shillings, 20p. I'll say it again. 20p, your first day's pay. And even that was a rise on what soldiers had been paid during the war, which had finished only 10 years before. My father told me that when he joined up in 1939, his first week's pay was 5 shillings, 25p. So you see, it's all relative. This is an account of national service by someone who found himself in the army in a platoon of about 24 young men who had been labelled as potential leaders, but they didn't know how or why. It is about their early basic training. Chapter 1. National service began in 1948 and ended in 1963. In the later decades of the 20th century, they often used to ask famous people about their memories of it. As often as not, you've got a chronicle of woe and a diatribe of recrimination, all about mindlessness and boorishness and endless repetition and stupid rules, about degradation and humiliation and abuse, about interruption of promising careers and the warping of delicate aesthetic tastes. As if the armed forces had a monopoly on mindlessness and stupid rules. Had they never heard of the civil service, or endless committee meetings, or question time in the House of Commons? Why single out the army for its apparent absence of logical and rational thought? As for endless repetition, anybody who has had anything to do with the art of instruction will tell you that the oldest, safest, most proven, and most permanent way to get something into someone's head is to repeat it in one form or another. Doesn't have to be the same way every time. Mind molders from Confucius to Hitler have subscribed to this idea. Look at all the advertising jingles we learn from the television, and we're not even listening. Speaking as one who has been on the receiving or the giving end of education for most of his life, I've often been struck by the force's excellent record in this field. When they teach you something, pardon me, firstly, they tell you all about it from A to Z. Secondly, they teach you systematically and logically. It may be tied hand and foot to the training pamphlet, but the training pamphlet does contain all the vital, relevant knowledge. It is a sort of expert. And thirdly, when they finish teaching you, you stay taught. I would bet that the most carping critics among those intellectuals I spoke about could remember, or all of them remember, their army numbers, or Navy or Air Force. Degradation, humiliation, abuse, well, of course, there must have been some. But the armed forces do not have a monopoly of it. Is the office or the factory floor free from it? Or the public school changing room? Or the football terrace? Or the council estate? And while we're on the subject, and supposing for a minute that the moaners were right, how come the British fighting soldier in the 1950s, the high watermark of national service, was still, 10 years after the war, reckoned to be the most reliable and adaptable human combat unit in the world? Not all the fighting was being done by the regular army. I was at college with someone who had lost a leg in Korea in his national service, and I did not detect a trace of bitterness in his makeup or his speech or his manner. Which brings us to the interruption of promising careers. 2 years of roughing it with unsavoury common people, accommodation which will make a Spartan wince, nasty, dirty jobs to do in nasty, dirty parts of the world, the trauma of separation from the balmy groves of academe. Have you noticed the ambition of numbers of school leavers? Here they all are, with their bunches of A-levels and their prefects' badges and their first 11 colours, and their places at university assured, but they can't wait to take time out to see the world. Doing what? Catching lifts on trans-globe odysseys in bone-shaking lorries full of scowling Kurdish freedom fighters, bottle-feeding starving infants in Uganda, horse breaking in the outback, kipping 50 to a room in a longhouse in Borneo. The rougher, the dirtier, the dodgier, the better. And they fully expect this experience to prove beneficial in their university and future careers. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a possibility, two possibilities. Firstly, that those vociferous intellectual critics might be wrong. Secondly, that the abiding impression about national service that has reached us has been shaped, or rather warped, by the memories of those very critics, for the simple reason that they were the ones who got into print, into the newspapers, on the radio, and onto the box. Far from their careers being blighted by 2 years in uniform, some of them craftily built their careers out of it. Plays like Chips with Everything and The Long and the Short and the Tall, I venture to suggest, did nothing bad for the respective authors' bank balances. Now, suppose the silent majority were to speak up. It might tell us what it was really like for that majority. For example, we know next to nothing about what life was like for a medieval peasant. Because your average medieval peasant could neither read nor write. And even if he could, he would have had little time in a busy day to record his experiences and his thoughts. We have to deduce a life for him from the pitiful and scanty remains of artifacts and field systems, and from the pious remarks of his superiors, who generally thought it was a good thing for a peasant to be a peasant because it was God's scheme for everything. Suppose those peasants had been able to speak. Now, I wasn't a particularly brilliant undergraduate, brilliant games player, nor a dazzling intellectual, nor a gifted writer. Not that much of a soldier either, if it comes to that. Yes, I know the fact that I was a university graduate marks me at once. But I was pretty ordinary for what I was, and that's the point. So I feel admirably placed to give the humdrum view, to show what it was probably like for the general run of us. It's about time to suggest that for many of us, national service was not necessarily the awful combination of Dotheboys Hall and Colditz Castle that our more articulate and literary survivors would impose upon a credulous world. It was no Butley's holiday camp either. It was like every other slice of our lives. A bit of good, a bit of bad, and a bit of ordinary. Large chunk of ordinary. Oh, and perhaps a little bit of funny as well. And seeing it like that, good, bad, indifferent, funny, isn't that what gets us through everything? We need reminding of this from time to time. We need alternative voices to those literary forces which have a distressing propensity to focus on the bad parts. War may have been hell, and of course still is. But I should like to put it to the jury, national service was not for most of us, and not for most of the time. It began, for all of us, intellectual and otherwise, budding playwrights and ploughboys, rebels and conformists, with a buff letter, sorry, not buff, a buff letter, on Her Majesty's service. You are required to report where to go, when to arrive. No more. No words wasted. But there was one charming little addition, a postal order, like a cheque for those who didn't have a bank balance. What was it? It was your first day's pay in advance. How considerate of them. 4 shillings, 20p. I'll say that again. 20p, your first day's pay. And even that was a rise on what soldiers had been paid during the war, which had finished only 10 years before. My father told me that when he joined up in 1939, his first week's pay was 5 shillings, 25p. So you see, it's all relative. To be strictly accurate, the letter was not my first brush with the military machine. I was 21, with a nearly complete 3-year university course behind me. National service normally began at 18. One of the great debates that raged, at any rate among the youth of the nation who hoped to go on to university, was which should come first, army or university. From now on, I shall use the word army as a means of referring to the armed forces generally, for there were many factors common to all 3 services. Yeah, army or university. We were given to understand that there was choice. Boys in their final year in hundreds of 6th forms up and down the country furrowed their pink brows and pondered the mighty question of whether a couple of years in uniform would make them more mature, as if they had any idea at that age, or would the sophistication of the universities equip them better to deal with service life. When to many a sneering corporal, anything beyond the 11 plus represented brains and was therefore suspect and ripe for cutting down to size. Incidentally, another great debate was whether membership of one's school cadet force enabled one the more easily to obtain a commission. Again, I don't remember any interviewing officer ever asking me whether I'd been in my school cadet force. My impression then and since is that the War Office couldn't have cared less whether we had, as 15-year-olds, clambered over some distant heath in oversized, bulging khaki uniforms, or daubed our downy cheeks with boot polish and crawled through soaking bracken on night patrols in the local park. More of this commission business later on. Oh, and I hadn't what? I hadn't been in the school cadet force. So once again, was it to be army first or university? No shortage of advice. Parents, neighbours, relations, we expect that. Most of it well-intentioned and ill-informed. At least they only think they knew best. Worse, far worse, were those who knew that they knew best. Everybody has a family acquaintance, like Mrs. Titchmarsh. Mrs. Titchmarsh was on all the committees, knows everybody, a brow and jawline like Mount Rushmore, never had a doubt in her life, fixes you with her eye and says, "And into what regiment are you going to be commissioned?" It's one of those, "When did you stop beating your wife?" questions, isn't it? Unluckily, this wasn't the new millennium, when you might have been tempted to tell the silly old bat that she was living in the wrong century. This was the 1950s. Young people didn't exist. The world had barely got used to the term teenager. A decade out of the war, we were unbelievably obedient, tightly mannered, and conformist, and pitifully unworldly. Into which regiment are you going to be commissioned? What could you do? How could you possibly say? You simply fiddled with the frayed hem of your knitting pattern pullover and mumbled something about not being quite sure yet, which would provoke a raised eyebrow or two and some heavily sententious remarks to the effect that one never got anywhere unless one showed decisiveness and determination. These were coupled with a comparison between us and the keen-eyed previous generation, which had known exactly where it was going and what it was going to do, the one which caused the Second World War. How enviable certainty is, especially when you don't have any. When you are too young to realize, as Peter Ustinov said, that it is the certainties in this world that divide people, the uncertainties that unite them. It is only later that you understand that certainty is, on the contrary, slightly frightening. Another species of expert is the overconfident retired army officer who keeps his military rank in civilian life, who fixes you with his eye and declares, without being asked, "Teach you a thing or two, my lad. Wish I had to do it all over again," which is banal, utterly predictable, and crushing in its unhelpfulness. So much for the family and the experts. Friends were not much better. Oh, the bullying is something awful. Their idea is to make life absolute hell for the first fortnight, just for the sake of it. A friend of mine said he cried himself to sleep for a week. It ruins you for study afterwards. Blokes at university are bags of nerves, can't concentrate, fluff their exams, get sent down. It ruins you for study. Chap I know had a nervous breakdown. People were jealous of his degree. They broke him, just like a dry stick. Broke him. You try to throw up a feeble barricade of resistance, if only for your own peace of mind. Surely some must survive. They're ready for that one too. Oh, good Lord, yes. I knew a chap who had a degree in maths. He got a position as paymaster in some regiment with captain's rank and pay. Oh, my brother-in-law's cousin knew a general who wangled him a job in the War Office. Just like any city businessman he was, never even wore a uniform. Oh, my friend went on the Army Russian course, spent 2 years at Cambridge. Then he came out and went to Oxford to read modern languages. Neat, isn't it? Bloke from my school went to live in Jersey. Never got called up at all. You only have to stay there till you're 26. And you can always be a conscientious objector. They make you clean lavatories instead. Which got you no nearer resolving the army or university first problem. It got you no nearer at all, as you had no degree in maths, no relative on the Imperial General Staff, no natural propensity for Slavonic languages, no burning desire to spend several years on the Channel Islands, and no obsession with indoor plumbing. You were faced with the awful prospect of a period of inhuman privation and mental torture, which had every likelihood of reducing you to a gibbering wreck within a month. At least it had the merit of forcing you back on yourself. It would have to be your own decision, for better or worse. Ignorance, immaturity, wrong priorities and all. So, Army, Navy, or Air Force. Not that a wayward selection officer would necessarily give you what you asked for, but one could always help. It was as well to be prepared. Not much trouble there for me. The Army, without question. Family tradition? Hardly. My father's father had worked for a grocery chain most of his working life, and my maternal grandfather had been a horse bus driver. My father volunteered in 1939 because, I fancy, he thought it would be fun. He always maintained afterwards that his veterinary practice had half died because so many people had had their pets put down when the war came, and of course the air raids. There was also the fact that the vast majority of recruits were sent, when their time came, into the army. It was far and away the biggest of the three armed forces. So, statistically, if I asked for the army, I had a greater chance of having my request fulfilled. More to the point, I preferred the sober security of the army. True, you get shot at in the army, probably more than in the Navy or the Air Force, but I didn't fancy getting shot at on the water. Even if you survived the shooting, there was still all that wet. And in the Air Force, all that air. I could, at a pinch, swim a bit, but as the man said, I couldn't fly an inch. No, if I was going to risk life and limb, I wanted solid earth under me. No senior service noble tradition for me. And as for the wide blue yonder, you could keep it. Now, university first or national service? There usually was a choice here. If you wanted to go straight on to college, you simply filled in a form, and that was, as far as I remember, that. Well, I'd enjoyed my school life, and I was very fond of history, my chosen subject. At the time, I could think of nothing I wanted to do more than 3 years of history, to say nothing of 3 years of hockey and cricket. If something unattractive, like national service, could be put off for 3 years, it was fine. The government might have changed its mind by then, who knew? And the clincher was the bird in the hand argument. At the end of that 3 years at college, I hoped to get a degree. Now, remember, these were the days before the great opening up of university education, before they built all those universities in places where they'd only had cricket grounds before. I was a boy from a very ordinary home. My mother and father had separated. My mother had brought me up single-handed on a shoestring. I was on school meals, and free milk, and free bus fares, and free education. To be going to university for a lad like me was quite something. Only one member of my father's family had ever done it, and nobody at all on my mother's side. Not all that many pupils from grammar schools went anyway. Not then. So having got this far, and having, I say myself, worked rather hard to get there, I was going to do nothing to jeopardize it. 2 years extra maturity after the army, you could keep it. What did it mean anyway? Thicker sideburns and a richer vocabulary of swear words. Well, fancy. No, get a degree. That became what I later discovered in the army. It was called the overall strategic objective. Whatever happened afterwards, whether I became a brilliant officer, a humble corporal, a mind-broken zombie, or a dehumanized killing machine, I would be able to put BA after my name. Nobody, barring miracles or Armageddon, will be able to take that away from me. So I filled in my deferment form and went off to college. That's the end of chapter 1. This is one of a series of chapters I wrote about the training of these potential leaders in a book entitled National Service, Earning the Pips.